Why is Scotland named after the Irish? And why, for most of 1,000 years, did the name Scotia mean Ireland? This is the story of how a country got made out of four peoples, two languages, a stolen name, and a very great deal of bad luck. It has more castles per mile than anywhere in Europe, a parliament that voted itself out of existence, and a village older than the pyramids. Start with the village. On the west coast of Orkney, under the dunes at the Bay of Scale, there are 8 stone houses joined by covered passages, stone beds, stone dressers, drains running under the floors. People were living in them from about 3,180 years before Christ. Not visiting. Living for 600 years. To put that in the order it belongs, when the last family walked out of Skara Brae, the Great Pyramid was not yet finished. Historic Environment Scotland puts these monuments alongside the mastabas of early Egypt, the brick temples of Sumer, and the first cities of the Indus. And Skara Brae is only the village. A few miles inland stand the standing stones of Stennes, the ring of Brodgar, and Maeshowe, a chambered tomb built so that on the shortest days of the year, the setting sun drives a beam of light straight down the entrance passage and onto the back wall. Whoever these people were, they were not scratching a living at the edge of the world. Orkney was the centre of something. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what language they spoke. Nothing they left can be read, because they left nothing written at all. That is the first thing to understand about Scotland. For most of its story, the people who lived here did not get to write it down. Other people wrote it down about them. The first of those were the Romans. By the year 80, Rome had taken Britain as far north as the Solway, and the governor Agricola pushed on into the country his son-in-law would call Caledonia. Somewhere in the northeast, he met a confederation of tribes in open battle and beat them. And then Rome did something it almost never did. It stopped. In the 20s of the 2nd century, the Emperor Hadrian ran a wall across the neck of the island. 20 years later, his successor abandoned it and built a second wall, 60 miles further north, from the Forth to the Clyde. 39 miles of turf on a stone base, 10 feet high, 16 feet thick, begun in the year 142. While it stood, it was the northernmost frontier of the Roman Empire. It stood for about 20 years. In 162, the legions walked back to Hadrian's Wall and never seriously came north again. Rome held Britain for 3.5 centuries. It never held this. So the empire drew a line across the island and, without meaning to, drew the first version of a border that is still there. North of it, the Romans named the people they could not conquer Picts, the painted ones. It is not what they called themselves. Nobody knows what they called themselves either. Now the answer to the question we opened with. In the late 3rd century, a new word starts appearing in Latin writing. Scotti. It is the Roman name for the Gaels, and the Gaels at that point are in Ireland. Not in Scotland. In Ireland. Scotti meant Irish, and Scotia, the land of the Scoti, meant Ireland. It kept meaning Ireland for centuries. As late as the reign of Robert the Bruce, scholars writing in Latin distinguished the two by size, and it went the way you would not expect. Ireland was Scotia Major, the Greater Scotia. Scotland was Scotia Minor, the Lesser. The reason is a kingdom called Dal Riata. By the 5th century, Gaels from the north of Ireland were established in Argyll, on the other side of a stretch of water you can see across on a clear day. 12 miles at the narrowest. For those people, it was not a border, it was a road. So the country now called Scotland is named after settlers from Ireland, in a word that originally meant Ireland, which is why the two places have never quite been able to explain their relationship to anyone else. The Gaels brought something else across with them. In the year 563, an Irish monk named Columba landed on a small island off the coast of Mull and founded a monastery there. Iona. Christianity did not reach Scotland from Rome. It reached it from Ireland, and from Iona it spread back out across the north into Pictland, and eventually south into Northumbria. For a couple of centuries, the intellectual centre of northern Europe was a Hebridean island you can walk across in an afternoon. Two peoples then, Picts in the east and north, Gaels in the west. Different languages, different kingdoms, the same island. In the 9th century, they became one kingdom. The traditional story gives the credit to a king called Syned mac Ailpin, Kenneth MacAlpin, and the traditional story is tidier than the truth, which involved a great deal of pressure from a third party we have not mentioned yet. The new kingdom was called Alba. It is still what Scotland is called in Gaelic. And the Picts, who had held out against Rome for 3 centuries, disappear from the record. Not killed. Absorbed. Their language dies, their kingdom becomes part of somebody else's, and within a few generations there is nobody left who calls themselves Pictish. That third party was the Norse. In 875, Harold Fairhair annexed Orkney and Shetland to Norway. Not raided, annexed, and they stayed Norwegian for the next 597 years. Think about what that means for the map. For 6 centuries, the northern third of what we now call Scotland was a different country, speaking a different language, under a different crown. Shetland is closer to Bergen than to London, and for most of its history that was not a curiosity. It was the point. They did not come back by conquest. In 1468, Christian I of Denmark and Norway betrothed his daughter Margaret to James III of Scotland, and he could not pay her dowry, so he pledged the islands against it. The money was never paid. In 1472, the Scottish Parliament simply absorbed them. Scotland got its Northern Isles because a Danish king was short of cash, and the debt has never been settled. That is the North. Now the South, and 200 years earlier. In 1286, the Scottish king rode his horse off a cliff in the dark and left no clear air. The Scots asked Edward I of England to arbitrate. He arbitrated. Then he kept going. In July 1300, he brought an army into the southwest, to a castle on the Solway, called Caerlaverock. A triangle, with a twin-towered gatehouse at the point and water on every side. Inside it, 60 men. Edward had 3,000 men at arms, 87 knights, named and counted. Engineers who built the siege engines on the spot and ships bringing the stone for them, 60 against 3,000. They held for 2 days. When the wall broke and the garrison came out, the English stopped and stared, because there were so few of them. We know because a herald riding with Edward wrote the siege down in verse, banner by banner, and he cannot get over it either. And the war was already 4 years old. In September 1297, an English army came north to Stirling, where the Forth stops being a river you can cross and becomes a river you cross in one place. 1 wooden bridge, 2 horsemen abreast, no more. William Wallace and Andrew Moray held the far bank and watched them start across. And they waited, not for the first men across, for the moment when enough had crossed to be worth killing and too few to fight their way back. Then they came down and took the bridgehead. The men who had crossed could not get out. The men who had not could only stand and watch. An English army destroyed by a bottleneck. Wallace was hunted for 8 years, betrayed and executed in London in a way designed to be talked about. It worked. In March 1430, men climbed the north face of the Castle Rock at Edinburgh in the dark, led by a man who had made the climb as a boy for reasons nothing to do with war. That rock has been besieged 26 times. 3 months later, Edward II came north with the largest army England had ever sent into Scotland, to relieve the last great castle still holding for him at Stirling. Robert Bruce chose the ground. The Cars below Stirling is flat, wet and cut by streams, and he made it worse, digging pits where cavalry would want to come. His men fought on foot, packed into rings of spears called schiltrons, which a horse will not charge. Over 2 days in June, the English were pushed off the dry ground and into the wet. Their cavalry could not reach the spears. Their archers could not shoot past their own knights, and the army was squeezed between the burn and the marsh until it broke. Edward escaped with 500 horse. His army did not. Bannockburn did not end the war. It ended the argument about whether Scotland had a king. 6 years later, the barons sealed a letter to the Pope with a line Scots still quote, that they fight not for glory, nor riches, nor honours, but for freedom alone, which no honest man gives up but with his life. Bruce died in 1329 and asked that his heart be carried to Jerusalem. James Douglas got it as far as Spain and was killed there. The story goes that he threw the casket ahead of him into the charge and shouted, "Lead on, brave heart, I will follow." The heart came home. It lies at Melrose Abbey, so the name in that film title was never Wallace's at all. It belonged to a dead king's heart. None of it made the country safe. In 1513, a Scottish king took an army into Northumberland and was killed at Flodden, along with most of the nobility, in a single afternoon. In 1560, the country changed church. England kept its bishops. Scotland got a Presbyterian kirk run from the bottom by elders, and John Knox thundering at anyone who disagreed. The kirk took on the schools, and the ambition was a school in every parish, which is much of why a poor country would later produce the thinkers we are coming to. Then in 1603, the thing nobody had managed by war happened by accident. Elizabeth of England died childless, and the nearest heir was the King of Scots. James VI rode south, was crowned James I of England, and never really came back. Nothing merged. 2 kingdoms, 2 parliaments, 2 churches, 2 legal systems, and 1 man wearing both crowns 400 miles away. It produced civil war, an occupation under Cromwell, and 2 countries with every reason to distrust each other and no way to separate. On the 13th of February, 1692, soldiers who had been quartered in Glencoe for nearly a fortnight, eating the food of the people they were staying with, got up before dawn and killed about 30 of them. This is the part that usually gets told wrong. It is remembered as a clan feud. Campbell against MacDonald. It was not. It was a government operation. The order came from John Dalrymple, the Secretary of State, whose letter of the 2nd of December, written before the deadline he was supposedly enforcing had even passed, said the clan must be rooted out. William III signed the orders. The regiment was a government regiment. The chief, Maciane, had missed a deadline to swear an oath by 6 days, and he had missed it partly because another chief sat on the letter that gave him permission to swear it. There was an inquiry 3 years later. It found that Dalrymple had a case to answer. He was dismissed. He was back in government by 1700. 3 years after that, the country made the worst decision in its history, and it made it out of hope. Scotland was poor, it was hungry, and it was locked out of England's colonies. So it founded a trading company of its own, and it asked ordinary people to fund it. They did. £400,000 sterling raised in weeks. By most estimates, about a fifth of all the money in the kingdom, put in by lairds, merchants, tradesmen and widows. All of it went to one point on the map. Darien, on the Isthmus of Panama, the thin neck of land between the Atlantic and the Pacific. Hold that, and you carry the world's goods between 2 oceans without sailing round the Americas. On a map, it is the best idea anyone ever had. 1,200 settlers sailed from Leith in July 1698. They landed in November and named the place Caledonia. It was rainforest. The rains came and fever came with them. The goods they had brought to trade, wigs, combs, and heavy woolen cloth, were worthless in the tropics. England wanted no rival on that coast and ordered its own colonies to send no help. They abandoned Caledonia in July 1699. Of the 1,200, 300 were alive. A second fleet of more than 1,000 arrived that November, not knowing. They were gone by February. Around 2,500 Scots sailed for Darien. A few hundred came home. The money went with them, and much of the country's capital went too. When the Treaty of Union came in 1707, it came with a payment. £398,085, 10 shillings. The equivalent. Just under 60% of it was set aside for the company's shareholders and its creditors. Scotland's Parliament voted itself out of existence. On the 1st of May, 1707, the 2 kingdoms became one. 90 years later, Robert Burns wrote the line the country still reaches for. Bought and sold for English gold. The last attempt to undo it ended on a wet moor outside Inverness in 1746, in under an hour. What came after Culloden was not a battle, and it mattered far more than one. The government set out to dismantle the society that had produced the rising. The clan chiefs lost their legal powers. Highland dress was banned. The old military structure of the glens was taken apart deliberately and by statute. And then something worse and slower. The chiefs, stripped of the power to raise men, discovered they were landlords, and that the land was worth more under sheep. Between about 1750 and 1860, the people of the glens were moved off. In 1814, on the Sutherland estate alone, around 2,000 people from 430 families were cleared out of Strathneva and Brora. In 1819, around 2,000 more. Some went to the coast, to land that could not feed them. Many went further. The Highland population had been rising for a century, and it peaked around 1851 at roughly 300,000. Then the potato blight that had crossed Ireland reached the west and the islands in 1846, and by the end of that year, around 3/4 of the people in the northwest had nothing to eat. The emigrations that followed are the reason there are more people of Scottish descent outside Scotland than in it. It took until 1886 and the Crofters Holdings Act before the people who were left were given security of tenure and the clearing finally stopped. Look at a population map of the Highlands today, and you are looking at the shape of that century. Here is the thing that makes no sense. In the same decades that the North was being emptied, the South was producing one of the most concentrated bursts of thought in European history. A country that had just lost its parliament produced David Hume, who took philosophy apart. Adam Smith, who wrote the book that still frames how we argue about markets. James Watt, whose engine did more to change the world than any battle in this video. Joseph Black, James Hutton, who worked out that the Earth was unimaginably old by looking at a cliff on the Berwickshire coast. And Glasgow, on the wrong side of the country for European trade, turned out to be on exactly the right side for the Atlantic. Tobacco, then cotton, then ships. By the end of the 19th century, 1/5 of the ships in the world were built on one river. So, a country named after Irish settlers, made out of Picts and Gaels and Norse and Northumbrians, that lost its parliament in 1707 and spent the next 3 centuries being told what it now was. In 1999, the parliament came back. In 2014, the country voted on whether to leave the union it had joined and voted to stay, and the question did not go away. Which returns us to where we started and to the thing that has been true the whole way through. The people at Skara Brae left no name for themselves. The Picts left no name we can read. The Gaels arrived with a name that belonged to another island, and it stuck to this one so completely that most people using it have no idea where it came from. Scotland has been named by other people almost every time, and it is still here, still arguing about what it is, which may be the most Scottish thing about it. If you got something out of that, subscribe. It is the one thing that decides whether we get to keep making them, and if there is a country you want mapped like this, the comments are the place to say so.